You see a UFO streaking across the Nevada desert, and your mind immediately goes to aliens, right? But for 40 years, that silver streak, that impossible speed, wasn't a visitor from another planet. It was the brainchild of one man, Kelly Johnson. He built Ghosts, planes that flew higher than the atmosphere and faster than a rifle bullet. He was the most secretive, most audacious engineer in American history, and his legend began not in a high-tech lab, but in a smelly circus tent next to a plastics factory. Before you continue reading about the incredible P-38 Lightning, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel right now if you think Johnson's Skunkworks team were the ultimate engineering rebels. Clarence Kelly Johnson was the tough, fiercely intelligent son of Swedish immigrants from a remote Michigan mining town. Poor, scrappy, and already radiating the arrogance of a genius who knew he was always the smartest person in the room. Bullied for his name, he fought back so hard they nicknamed him Kelly. He carried that fighting spirit into the polite, reserved world of aviation and utterly shattered it. In 1933, at just 23, Johnson joined the Lockheed Corporation. Most junior engineers kept their mouths shut, but not Kelly. On his very first assignment, he looked at the senior designer's model for the Electra airliner and delivered a brutal verdict. This is unstable. It's rubbish. The veterans were horrified. Who was this insolent kid? But they had a problem. He was right. Johnson fixed the flawed design, the Electra became a legend, and Lockheed suddenly realized they had a tiger by the tail. By 1937, with war looming, the U.S. Army needed a new fighter, a high-altitude interceptor with truly absurd requirements, demanding it fly at 360 miles per hour and climb like a rocket. Every other company insisted it was impossible with a single engine. So Kelly simply said, "Fine, I'll use two." He designed the P-38 Lightning, a radical beast that looked like two planes welded together, with a central pod for the pilot and guns flanked by massive booms for the engines. Critics called it a monstrosity, but when it flew, it didn't just fly, it screamed. It was the first fighter to top 400 miles per hour. Its speed was so unprecedented that it ran headlong into a deadly new phenomenon no pilot had ever faced: compressibility. As the plane approached the speed of sound, the air couldn't move out of the way fast enough, forming a shock wave that froze the controls, sending the plane plunging to its death. The sound barrier wasn't a wall, it was a graveyard. Kelly Johnson didn't sleep. He worked the problem, inventing the simple metal strip called dive flaps to disrupt the shock wave. While other engineers were just guessing, Johnson was calculating. He saved the plane, and the plane saved the war, flying the mission in total radio silence to shoot down Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor. While the P-38 was dominating the Pacific, a new threat emerged in Europe. Intelligence reports warned the Germans had something new: a plane without propellers, the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet plane. The U.S. Air Forces panicked. They were bringing a knife to a gunfight. In utter desperation, the Air Force called Lockheed, asking Kelly Johnson how long it would take to build an American jet prototype. 2 years? 3 years? Kelly didn't blink. "I'll give you a jet in 180 days. The room went silent. 180 days was impossible. It barely covered the time needed to design the landing gear. But Johnson had a condition. "I can do it, but you have to leave me alone. No bureaucracy, no inspections, no interference. I pick the team, I pick the hours, and nobody tells me how to run my shop." The general, cornered, agreed. There was no space in the busy factory for Kelly's secret project, so they rented a circus tent and an old machine shop next to a plastics factory. The stench was unbearable, a mix of burning plastic and rotting chemicals. One engineer, wearing a gas mask, answered a phone call by joking, "Skunkworks," a reference to a moonshine distillery in a popular comic strip. The name stuck. Johnson handpicked 23 engineers, the best of the best, and laid down his law: the 14 Rules of Management. Rule 12, mutual trust. Rule 13, access strictly restricted. He created a cult of speed. Be quick, be quiet, be on time. They worked 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, relying on slide rules and intuition. Johnson was everywhere,
checking rivets, shouting at suppliers, sweeping the floor. On day 143, 37 days ahead of the impossible schedule, the XP-80 Shooting Star was ready. They towed it out to a dry lake bed. Kelly Johnson, chewing on a cigar, had bet his entire reputation on this moment. It flew. It was the first operational American jet fighter, built in a tent by a bunch of rebels who ignored every rule in the book. But for Kelly Johnson, the P-80 was just the appetizer. The war ended, but a new enemy was rising: the Soviet Union. This Cold War would be fought with secrets, and the government needed eyes in the sky.
They needed a plane that could fly so high Russian radar couldn't see it. The CIA approached the Air Force with a radical idea: a plane that could fly at 70,000 feet, the edge of space. The Air Force said it was physically impossible. The air was too thin. So the CIA rang Kelly Johnson. Kelly simply redesigned the plane, bolting massive, glider-like wings onto a jet fuselage. He called it the CL-282. The CIA called it the U-2. To reach that altitude, the plane had to be impossibly light. Kelly was obsessive, removing the armor, the ejection seat, and even the landing gear. He designed pogo wheels, stabilizers that fell off on takeoff. To land, the pilot had to balance the plane on a central bicycle wheel like a circus act. It was fragile, a flying camera made of tinfoil. And where do you test a secret plane that doesn't officially exist? Kelly found a remote salt flat in Nevada, a hostile place he called Paradise Ranch to trick the workers into coming. Today, we know it as Area 51. August 1955, the U-2 flew. Pilots, wearing partial pressure suits because their blood would boil if the cabin depressurized, looked down on the curvature of the Earth like gods. For 4 years, the U-2 was invincible, flying over the Soviet Union with impunity, photographing missile silos and bomber bases. The Russians could see the ghost on their radar, but their missiles exploded miles below. But technology never stands still. On May 1, 1960, Francis Gary Powers, flying deep over Russia, felt safe. He was untouchable. But the Russians had developed a new missile, the SA-2 guideline, and they fired a barrage. The shockwaves snapped the U-2's fragile wings. The plane disintegrated. Powers was captured. The United States was caught red-handed. Kelly Johnson watched the news in horror. Physics had caught up with him. Altitude was no longer a shield. If he can't hide up high, there's only one other way to survive. You have to outrun the bullet. The terrified CIA returned to the skunk works. Kelly Johnson leaned back. He had already been thinking. We stop floating, and we start sprinting. He proposed a plane that would fly at Mach 3, 3 times the speed of sound, faster than a rifle bullet. A plane so fast that by the time enemy radar detected it, it would already be gone. But at Mach 3, the friction of the air is so intense that aluminum would melt like butter. The plane had to be built from titanium, an incredibly rare, hard to work with, and expensive metal. There was just one problem. The U.S. didn't have enough titanium. The Soviet Union did. In one of the greatest ironies of the Cold War, the CIA set up fake companies to secretly purchase the titanium from Russia, the very metal the Soviets were selling to build the spy plane designed to defeat them. Project Oxcart. The resulting plane, the SR-71 Blackbird, looked like a dagger. It was the most difficult engineering challenge in history. They had to invent new tools to cut the metal and new fuel that wouldn't explode at 400 degrees Celsius. The plane even leaked fuel on the runway. To an outsider, it looked broken, a disaster. But to Kelly Johnson, it was perfect. The metal panels were built loose, designed to expand only when hot. At over 2,000 miles an hour, the air friction would heat the titanium skin to 500 degrees Celsius, sealing the panels. If he built it tight on the ground, it would rip itself apart in the air. It only sealed itself when it screamed. The pilots who flew it wore spacesuits. They were flying at the edge of space, so fast you could watch the sunset, turn the plane around, and watch it rise again in the west. It was the ultimate paradox, a plane fragile on the ground but invincible in the sky. The standard operating procedure for an SR-71 pilot when a surface-to-air missile was detected was simple. No fancy maneuvers, no diving. The pilot simply pushed the throttle forward. The Blackbird would accelerate.
The missile, traveling at its maximum speed, would simply run out of fuel and fall back to Earth. It was the only aircraft in history that could outrun a bullet. Building the ultimate plane took a toll. Kelly Johnson ran the Skunk Works like a dictator, notorious for his nickel tour. If an engineer made a mistake, Kelly would flip a nickel onto his desk and say, "Call your wife, tell her you've been fired." He was brutal, but his team loved him because he protected them, throwing out Air Force generals who tried to interfere and threatening to quit when bureaucrats tried to cut the budget. He built a wall around his engineers so they could do the impossible. Did you know the SR-71 Blackbird was so hot it was literally cooled by the speed of sound? Drop a comment below with your favorite fact about Kelly Johnson's rules. As the 1970s rolled in, the world changed again. Radar was getting better. Speed was no longer enough. Kelly knew the era of faster and higher was ending. The next era would be invisible. Before he retired in 1975, having designed 40 aircraft, he laid the groundwork for the next revolution, stealth. But the DNA of the Skunk Works, the secrecy, the speed, the can-do attitude, that was all Kelly. He watched as the industry he had dominated became slow and bureaucratic, everything he hated. In 1990, the SR-71 was retired. On its final flight, it broke one last record, flying from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C. in just 64 minutes. The pilots walked out and handed the flight log to the Smithsonian Museum. The ink was still wet. Kelly Johnson died that same year. It was as if he and his greatest creation were tied together by an invisible string. When the bird stopped flying, the master stopped breathing. Today, you can stand under the Blackbird at the Smithsonian. You can see the titanium skin that rippled at Mach 3, the leak points, and the impossible design. It looks like science fiction, but it wasn't built by aliens.
It was built by a poor boy from Michigan who refused to listen to the word impossible. Kelly Johnson didn't just build planes, he built the future. And he did it in a tent with a slide rule and a promise. Be quick, be quiet, and be on time. The legacy of Kelly Johnson, however, did not cease with his retirement or his death. His 14 rules of management became a sacred text for a new generation of engineers within Lockheed, an almost spiritual guide on how to bypass the suffocating weight of corporate and military bureaucracy. These rules, handwritten notes tacked onto a wall in that original stinking tent, were distilled wisdom, a blueprint for radical efficiency and uncompromising excellence. Rule 6, for instance, demanded simple, straight-line organization. Only 2 people were needed to sign off on a design change: the project engineer and the chief engineer, Kelly himself. This simple decree cut through the multi-layered, committee-driven approval processes that plagued every other aerospace company, shaving years off development schedules. Johnson understood that genius often gets strangled by paper, and he was the iron fist that protected his team's ability to execute. After Johnson stepped down as vice president of advanced development projects, the Skunk Works faced its first real test of survival without its founding titan. The aerospace industry was pivoting hard toward computer-aided design, massive corporate mergers, and the very bureaucratic bloat Johnson had fought his entire life. The new challenge was to build a plane that wouldn't just be faster or higher, but one that would be fundamentally invisible to the electromagnetic spectrum, the first true stealth aircraft. This was not a problem of speed, it was a problem of geometry and physics, a radical new way of thinking about flight. The principles of the Skunk Works were put to their ultimate stress test. Could a tight-knit, secretive team still deliver a revolutionary design in an era of sprawling defense contracts and overwhelming computational power? Engineer Rich was a brilliant thermal and propulsion expert, but his greatest inheritance was Johnson's cultural shield. He maintained the isolation of the Skunk Works, keeping the project shrouded in black secrecy, even from other Lockheed divisions. The design team for Have Blue was laughably small, only 50 engineers.
Their resources were meager, and their location was still the desolate, familiar salt flats of Area 51, where the U-2 and Blackbird had first stretched their wings. The core technology of stealth was developed by a Lockheed mathematician named Dennis Overhoser, who, using an IBM mainframe, wrote the first computer program to calculate the radar cross-section, or RCS, of an object. The program, later famously dubbed ECHO, revealed that the smoothest, most aerodynamic shapes, the very shapes Kelly Johnson had perfected for Mach 3 flight, were, ironically, the worst for stealth. They acted like perfect parabolic dishes, reflecting radar straight back to the source. The lowest RCS was achieved by a radically faceted, non-aerodynamic shape covered in sharp, flat panels, a hopeless diamond that scattered radar energy away from the transmitting source. The resulting half-blue prototype looked like nothing that had ever flown. It was angular, almost cubist, a collection of flat trapezoidal panels taped together, resembling a flying stealth fighter in a low-resolution video game. Pilots who first saw it were horrified. It was unstable in flight and required a revolutionary, custom-designed fly-by-wire computer system to keep it from tumbling out of the sky, a direct violation of Johnson's preference for simple, direct mechanical controls. But Rule 1, the Skunk Works manager must be delegated practically complete control of the program, applied. Rich was allowed to break Johnson's aesthetic rules because he was following Johnson's deeper, governing principle, do the impossible. The half-blue crashes were inevitable. The plane was a testbed, unstable by design, flying on the bleeding edge of physics and computer science. 2 prototypes were lost to accidents, but the secrecy held. The project's security was so tight that when a recovery crew was dispatched to retrieve the wreckage of one crash, they were ordered to smash the components into pieces small enough to be carried out in garbage bags, ensuring no recognizable shape would be observed. The success of Half Blue, proven in repeated classified trials, was its invisibility. It returned a radar signature smaller than a man's fist, a mere blip compared to the massive return of a conventional fighter. This success led directly to the F-117 Nighthawk, the world's first operational stealth ground attack aircraft. The Nighthawk's development, Project Senior Trend, exemplified the Skunk Works philosophy in its purest form. It was developed quickly, quietly, and entirely out of the public eye. The final aircraft, a full scale of the Half Blue Diamond, first flew in 1981. But its existence was not publicly acknowledged by the Department of Defense until 1988, 7 years later. This period of deep operational secrecy allowed the U.S. Air Force to train pilots, develop tactics, and deploy the aircraft into active service, giving them an overwhelming advantage in the first Gulf War. The F-117 was the physical embodiment of Johnson's intellectual legacy, not built by his hand, but built by his rules. It wasn't beautiful, but it was perfect for its mission. In 1991, during Operation Desert Storm, the F-117s flew a disproportionately small number of sorties, less than 3% of the total, but they hit over 40% of the highest-value strategic targets. They flew through the most heavily defended airspace in the world and sustained 0 combat losses. They were ghosts. They achieved their survival not through speed like the Blackbird, but through simply not being there, an absence where a plane should have been. The dictum of outrun the bullet had been replaced by don't let the enemy know you've been fired at. As the 1990s gave way to the 21st century, the Skunk Works continued to be the clandestine think tank for American air superiority. The design principles shifted again. With the success of the F-117, stealth became a fundamental requirement, not a radical experiment. The challenge evolved from making a plane stealthy to making a supersonic fighter stealthy, merging the conflicting demands of high-speed aerodynamics and low radar cross-section. This led to the development of the F-22 Raptor and later the F-35 Lightning II, programs vastly larger than the Blackbird or the Nighthawk, incorporating billions of lines of code and massive industrial bases. The transition to these large multinational projects tested the limits of Johnson's 14 rules. While the core team within the Skunk Works, responsible for the initial, truly advanced design concepts, maintained the Johnsonian ethos of small, protected teams, the sheer scale of final production required compromise with the bureaucratic reality Kelly had once so fiercely rejected. For Johnson, 2 people signed off on a design change. For the F-35, it could be dozens of committees across multiple continents. Yet the foundational breakthroughs, the initial audacious leap from the conventional to the revolutionary, still originated in the small, sealed-off corners of the Skunk Works. The ghost of Kelly Johnson, the uncompromising Swede from Michigan, still walked the shop floor, demanding that engineers trust their slide rules and their intuition over the endlessly debated findings of consensus committees. The next great leap was, predictably, into the realm of the truly unmanned. While Johnson was a pilot's engineer, believing the man in the cockpit was the ultimate decision-maker, his philosophy of radical performance adapted seamlessly to drones and remotely piloted vehicles. The Skunk Works has been involved in several black projects exploring the limits of autonomous flight, especially in contested airspace. The speed and secrecy, be quick, be quiet, be on time, are even more critical in the digital age, where a technological advantage can be replicated and neutralized in months, not years. The development of Advanced Unmanned Combat Aerial Vehicles, UCAVs, represents the ultimate expression of the ghost concept, a machine with no human life to risk, a silent, invisible presence that can loiter, observe, and strike with surgical precision. Consider the challenge of hypersonic flight, speeds of Mach 5 and above. This domain presents a return to the extreme thermal and structural problems that defined the SR-71 Blackbird. At Mach 5, the air friction is so intense that the skin of the aircraft experiences temperatures far exceeding those faced by the Blackbird. The structure must be able to withstand not just high heat, but rapid, dynamic thermal loading, a modern analog to the Blackbird's metal panels designed to expand to fit. The Skunk Works has, inevitably, been at the forefront of the technology required for this new era, pushing the boundaries of material science, propulsion systems like scramjets, and advanced thermal management. They are building the next generation of streaks in the Nevada desert, planes that are faster than anything Kelly Johnson imagined, but which are following the same playbook, solving a problem the rest of the industry declares impossible. Kelly Johnson's true genius was not just in aerodynamics or materials, it was in organizational structure. He created an environment where engineers were empowered to make decisions and, crucially, to make mistakes and learn from them without public or corporate humiliation. His infamous nickel-tour firings, while harsh, were balanced by his staunch defense of his team against outsiders. He created a psychological space where intellectual risk-taking was encouraged, a fundamental requirement for revolutionary breakthroughs. This culture, the non-negotiable core of the Skunk Works, is what ensures its enduring relevance. In a world where modern defense projects are often political campaigns as much as engineering endeavors, the Skunk Works remains an anomaly, a sanctuary for pure, focused engineering execution.
The story of the Skunk Works is a perpetual cycle of challenge, secrecy, and triumph, each chapter building upon the last with a fidelity to the founding rules that borders on fanatical. The P-38 solved compressibility. The P-80 pioneered jet propulsion in 1,880 days. The U-2 conquered the edge of space. The SR-17 defeated the missile with sheer velocity, and the F-117 mastered invisibility. Each aircraft was a response to a direct existential threat, and each response was delivered under the cloak of deep classification, protecting the advantage until it was operationally mature. The greatest challenge now is maintaining this culture in an age of instantaneous information and global collaboration. The enemy Johnson fought was the Soviet Union. The enemy his successors fight is the diffusion of knowledge and the complacency of bureaucracy. The principles remain the same: small team, minimum paperwork, maximum trust, and absolute authority delegated to the chief engineer. Think about the next time you hear a mysterious sonic boom or see a strangely shaped object on a grainy video. It is almost certainly not a visitor from outer space. It is the continuation of a 90-year lineage, the latest ghost built by a tradition forged in a stinking circus tent.
It is a machine that flies outside the known rules of aviation, a practical demonstration that the limits of engineering are constantly being redefined, not by massive state-run efforts, but by a small, dedicated group of rebels working on a deadline and following the strictures of a tough Swedish-American genius. The tools have changed, from SLAD rules to terascale supercomputers, the materials from aluminum to exotic ceramics, but the spirit of Kelly Johnson remains the engine of American aerospace audacity. He taught them how to build a secret, and in doing so, he built a permanent culture of the impossible. The work continues, quietly, somewhere beyond the fence, in a lab where the only rule that truly matters is be quick, be quiet, and be on time. And above all, never let the paperwork catch up to the airplane. That single-minded focus on the physical artifact, the flying machine, over the process or the politics, is the ultimate measure of Kelly Johnson's lasting, profound influence on the entire trajectory of modern flight. His story is the ultimate proof that a fierce will and a brilliant mind, protected from the stifling hand of convention, can literally change the world's atmosphere. If you were Kelly Johnson, what impossible challenge would you take on today? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories of engineering legends.